In this section of the course, we're going to take a deeper look at many of the objects within the Excel object model, starting with application at the very top. Application, of course, is concerned with top-level global application-based settings, kind of the universal settings that are going to stay constant no matter what workbook you're working with or what worksheet you're working with. Most of VBA programming boils down to identifying the right object in the hierarchy and then issuing it the right message, the right method, if you will, giving it the proper command to do what it is that you want. So let's begin here by declaring a procedure. We're going to call it Fun with Application. And we're just going to take a look at a couple properties and one method that's available on application. So I'm just going to do a bunch of debug prints here. The first one I want to show you is application.name. This is actually going to give us the name of our application, which of course is going to be Microsoft Excel. On application, we also have a convenient property called path. Path is actually going to give us the installation directory of the Excel application as a whole. So not the location of the workbook that we currently have open, but the actual Excel core functionality that's created by Microsoft. So Excel on my computer is installed in this directory, program files, Microsoft Office root Office 16. This can be particularly effective if you want to find the location of a given program, not just Excel, but let's say another Microsoft Office application. All right, we also have a convenient property available on application called version. Now, when we talk about Excel kind of in conventional business terms, each version is given a popular name that is year-based. So for example, Excel 2013 or Excel 2016. But behind the scenes, Excel also has a numeric version number, kind of a more technical name for it behind the scenes. And Excel 2016 has the version number 16. Now, you may be asking, what's the point of this? Well, a good scenario that you can think about is having to build code that is going to run in any version of Excel, including previous versions. And let's say you want to run a feature that is only available in a newer version of Excel, like 2016. You might have to write some conditional logic, which just means logic that follows multiple branches or multiple directions. You might have some kind of logic that says, if we have a version of Excel like 2016 or greater that has a specific feature that we can also use in VBA, let's go ahead and use that feature. Otherwise, if the version is less than that, we have to go ahead and write a different branch of logic, a different set of steps to take in order to account for that feature that we don't have access to in an earlier version of Excel. So this can be particularly helpful when you want to find out what version of Excel you're working with, and as an extension of that, what features you actually have access to. One more property I want to show you here in this lesson, and that's going to be the application username property. This is going to show you the top level user that's registered with the application. And of course, for me, it's just me. You can see right here, Boris. All right, so these are the 4 properties that I want to show you on the application object. There are more. I just want to show you some of them to kind of get you thinking about what is available in application. Again, these are not workbook or worksheet specific. These are top level global universal properties across the entire application. One cool method that's available on application, I'm actually going to execute it right here after saving my work, is application.quit. And predictably, what this is going to do is quit or terminate the entire Excel application. Notice here that I don't have to prefix this method with a question mark in the immediate window because I am issuing a command. I'm not asking a question. And quit is going to just exit the entire application. Keep in mind that if you have some unsaved changes in your workbook, it will still prompt you with the standard save as dialog box that says, would you like to save this workbook? I think it shouldn't do that here because I have saved, so it should just take us straight to our desktop. So I'm just going to press enter here and we should quit automatically. And there we go, we're taken straight to the desktop, and that's it. That's all there's to cover in this lesson. We talked about the application object and some of its properties, including name, path, version, and username. And we also took a look at the quit method, which terminates the entire application. And throughout this entire section, we're going to take a deeper look at some of the other objects within the Excel object model, including the workbook, worksheet, and more. So I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the display alerts property on the application object. This property actually allows us to enable or disable alerts within Excel. What is an example of an alert? It's simply one of those dialog boxes or pop-up boxes that appear from time to time to warn the user of something, to alert them of something. One example is the save box, which appears if you attempt to exit a workbook without saving. So for example, if I write a value here in my Excel workbook, and I attempt to quit the workbook, This box that pops up here is one example of a alert in Excel. I'm just going to go ahead and cancel out of here. And sometimes when it comes to writing VBA, it may be beneficial for us to disable alerts temporarily while the procedure is running to make the entire process as smooth as possible for the user. Remember that whenever an alert pops up in Excel, what it's actually going to do is halt the execution of the macro, so temporarily pause it mid-execution. So for example, if we have a macro that attempts to close a workbook and the workbook is not saved, the user will still be prompted with that box that we just saw, would you like to save? And that's going to pause the macro temporarily while it's running. And that sometimes is a little bit of an uncomfortable experience for the user because they still have to click around and they still have to think about something. Sometimes it is beneficial to make it as simple as possible for the user by making them simply execute the macro and taking care of all of those decisions for them, just assuming a default, for example. So sometimes it depends on how you want to build the application and what it is that you're trying to do, what your business goals are. But sometimes we simply want a macro to be the final end-all be-all, and we want to make sure the user takes the minimum number of steps necessary, and we just kind of go forward with whatever it is that we want to execute. It's in those kinds of situations that it's beneficial to temporarily disable alerts at the beginning of the macro so that Excel doesn't annoy the user with any of them. And then at the end, when all of our code is done executing, we simply re-enable the alerts to bring them back and so that the user has them in their standard Excel user experience. Here's how we can do something like that. Here's what I want to do with our code in this lesson. I currently have two workbooks open. One of them is the application object right here, and one of them is this second workbook called the report. The second workbook is not relevant here. I simply want two workbooks open because what we're going to do in this macro is close one of them. And if I only have one workbook open and I close it, then that's going to close the entire Excel Visual Basic Editor as a whole. And I just want it to stay open so we can see the impact of our code. So this report simply exists just so this example can work. So I'm currently in the module 1 code for the application object, and I'm going to write a procedure here, and I'm just going to call it close workbook. And we're going to go ahead and try to close the workbook that we're currently on, which is the application object, even though it's going to have content that is not going to be saved. And what we're going to do is avoid that save box that pops up that we just saw a moment or two ago. So what I want to do here is, first of all, I'm going to write the code to actually close the workbook, and we want to find out what that workbook is first, and I'm pretty sure it's just going to be workbook number 1 here. So I can do a quick search here. In here, I can find the first workbook. In my workbooks collection, find its name. Okay, so that's the application object workbook. That's the one that I actually want to close. So what I'm going to do here is right here, I'm going to do workbooks one.close. That is the method available on a workbook object to close it, right? It doesn't close the application Excel. That's the application quit method. This just closes a specific workbook that we have open. All right, so right now, as I mentioned, we have a property called display alerts on application, and it's a Boolean. It's actually going to give us a true or a false, and it's both readable and writable. So what we can do in the immediate window is find out what its current value is. And that is right here, display alerts, and it's currently set to true, which means alerts are enabled, they will be visible. So what I want to do at the top of the procedure is temporarily disable them. So I'm going to do display alerts, and I'm going to set this to false. Setting it to false means that alerts will not be displayed. It disables them, it turns them off. So this means when this, not this procedure, but rather this line of code within the procedure runs, our alerts are going to be disabled. So any dialog boxes or alerts that are associated with this close operation, such as that save, will no longer be displayed. They will simply be skipped. So if the user hasn't saved worked, not a problem. We're simply going to not display that alert and simply force the closing of the workbook, basically a not save operation. So what I want to do at the very end of the procedure is after all my actual macro code is done, or the core of the code, I want to go ahead and re-enable display alerts just to make sure we don't lose that functionality in Excel, because since this is a global application-wide setting, we're going to disable alerts everywhere, and we don't want to do that. We just want to do it for the purposes of this operation. We then want to make sure we bring things back to their original shape, bring the configuration back to its default, just so that we don't break anything. Right, so it's going to be pretty simple. We're going to disable the alerts. We're going to close the workbook, no matter whether it's saved or not saved, and then we're going to re-enable alerts. So let's take a look at this in action. I'm going to clear this right here. I'm actually going to save this just so we have this code for later, but after I'm done saving the code right here in the Visual Basic Editor, I'm going to go back out into my worksheet right here and make some kind of change, like hello. All right, so I'm going to enter that. My workbook is now unsaved. I'm going to go into this code right here and execute close workbook with F5, and You can see it's going to close that workbook exactly as expected. You'll notice even though we had unsaved content, which is that hello, we were not prompted with the alert that said, would you like to save, because we temporarily disabled it. You'll notice the Visual Basic Editor here is still open because we still have our report, which is the other one that I had open, but everything worked as expected. We were successfully able to close a workbook without displaying alerts. And obviously that's just one example of an alert. There are many others in Excel. Whenever you create new worksheets, there's an alert that pops up, many other operations. So if you want to make the process of something as simple as possible for the user, and you don't want them to confirm something, and you don't want them to be taken out of the process, you don't want to halt the execution of a macro, this is a pretty popular paradigm to follow in your code, to have a procedure that does something, and then before you're about to do it, you temporarily disable those alerts by setting display alerts to false, and then at the end of the macro, when you're done doing anything that might enable an alert, you bring things back to their original shape by writing application.display alerts equals true. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, and we're going to talk about this property a couple more times throughout the course. You're going to see some more applications of it. So I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the count property on both the worksheets and workbooks collection objects. We'll begin with worksheets, and the worksheets count property is pretty simple. It's simply going to give you back an integer value that represents the total number of worksheets in the currently active workbook. So right now I have one workbook open. There's only one sheet in here, sheet 1. So if I go into my immediate window and I find my worksheets collection object, and I go count, I'm simply going to get a value of 1. If I create a few more worksheets in here just by clicking the plus sign, here's a couple more, and I get the value of the property again, we're now going to have a total of 4 worksheets in this currently active workbook. An important caveat to remember here is that Excel actually has 2 types of sheets available. The first is a worksheet, which is what we see here on the left, which is just used for data. And the second type is actually something called a chart sheet, which is what we use whenever we want a sheet to hold, for example, an entire bar graph or a pie chart. In this case, we don't have any, so all of the sheets that we have here are worksheets. But there is a property available called sheets, and this will give you the total amount of total sheets, which includes both worksheets and chart sheets. So right now, because we only have worksheets, the value is going to be the exact same. But if we were to have 4 worksheets and, for example, 2 chart sheets, this would give you 6, while worksheets count would give you strictly the number of literal worksheets or data sheets. All right, now let's go on and move on to the workbooks count property. That's going to give you the total number of open workbooks in the Excel application. So if I get my workbooks collection object and get count, we're still going to get 1. I'm going to go ahead and create 2 new workbooks just so we can simulate multiple workbooks being open. So I'm just going to press Control New here a couple times. There's my new workbook, and there is another new workbook. So now if I go back to my immediate window in my Visual Basic Editor and I re-execute this, we're going to get a new value for the property, and that is equal to 3. This, again, is the total number of workbooks that are currently open in Excel, so the count of workbooks. Pretty simple. All right, that's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I'll see you in the next one. In this lesson, I want to offer a review of the workbook's open method, which opens another workbook, and the path property on a single workbook object, which tells us the path or the file location of a given file. So what I want to do here is write a basic macro that's going to offer a different workbook than the one we're in. I'm currently in a file called the workbooks object, and in the exact same directory, I have another Excel file called report.xlsm, and I want to go ahead and open it here, as well as talk about some of the quirks or problems you might run into whenever attempting such an operation. So what I'm going to do here is create a procedure called open some file. And I believe there was actually a challenge earlier that you tackled where you had to deal with this method, the open method on the workbooks collection object. And sometimes when you're dealing with files in the exact same directory, if you simply give the name of the file you want to open, that's going to work sometimes. But sometimes Excel and VBA are known to run into an error where it's going to be unable to figure out exactly where the file that you want to open is located. And the only way to remedy that is to actually provide the full path. So the exact location on your computer where the file is located, even if it's in the exact same folder as the workbook is from which you're running the macro. So what we can do here is do a couple of tricks to find out the current location of this file, the one that we're in right now. And because we know the file that we're trying to open, which is report, is in the same directory, we can then concatenate that file name to our current directory to get the full path to the file that we want to open. It's a little bit of a confusing concept, but hopefully it'll make more sense as we type it out. So the first thing I want to do is actually get the current location of the file that we're in. So on any workbook object, we have a property called path, which is going to give us the exact directory or path to our current file. I can show you this in our immediate window. So as a reminder, the workbook that is currently open and selected is the active workbook, and this is a regular workbook object. And on that, we have a property called path. Path is going to give us the entire path to this file. So this file, the workbooks object right here, is located within this directory structure. Notice that it doesn't actually give us the file name, it just gives us the path all the way to the current directory where the file is in. So what I can do is get access to this path in the context of my procedure and then concatenate on the name of my file that I want to open to the end of it. So here's how I can do something like that. I'll first declare a variable. I'm going to call it file path. And it is just going to represent a path, so it's going to be a string. And I can go ahead on the next line and assign it to what we just did in the immediate window, simply do the active workbook and get its path. So now I'm going to have this string assigned to the file path variable. On the next line, I can go ahead and try to open my report workbook. I'm eventually going to want to assign this to a variable, and the open method on the workbooks collection is actually going to return the open workbook to me as an object. Because I want to store that in a variable, I'm going to declare that workbook variable up front. So I'm going to do dim WB as a workbook. So now we're going to have a WB variable, and as a reminder, whenever we're assigning an object to a variable, rather than simply using the equal sign, we also have to use the set keyword. So I'm going to do set WB, and I'm going to set that equal to the open method on the workbooks collection. So as a reminder, the open method on the workbooks collection is going to open a brand new workbook, and then it's going to return a single workbook object to me, which I then want to assign to the WB variable, and then we're going to have access to it and can do all kinds of things to it. So here's where it gets tricky. Right here, we talked about this method a little bit previously. We have the first argument, which is a file name. It's expecting the actual name. And sometimes if you were to do simply something like report.xlsm, it's not guaranteed to work. So the best thing that we can do here is prefix this or prepend it with the full directory. So the way we can do that is like this. Right here before, I'm actually going to write file path, which is going to give me the exact path, the directory to where I am. But there's one more thing we have to do, two more things actually. The first, of course, is that we have to concatenate. We have to add on report.xlsm to the end. And you'll also notice here that if I were to simply take this and paste it right at the end, we're not exactly going to get what we want, because we actually need to place an additional slash in order to indicate that we're actually in that directory. So the path is going to give us the directory that we're in, but it's not going to add that last slash. So we have to add it manually right here before report. And now we're going to tell VBA, get the current file path, which is this thing right here. And then to the end of it, you want to concatenate this slash. And then report.xlsm, we have to make sure we close that open method call. As another reminder, we have to do parentheses whenever we're going to assign the return value of a method to a variable. So that's why we're using the parentheses for the open method. And this is just the first argument right here. We're just providing this concatenated string to represent the file path. All right, so that should do it. WB is now going to store the report workbook, assuming that it's been properly opened. And we can verify this by doing something like this. We can say message box, you've just opened. And to this, we can concatenate something like wb.name. Our report workbook will now have a name. And we can also alert the user to its path of our newly opened workbook, rather. So we can do the same path property that we saw earlier. We can say the file location of what you just opened is, and we're going to concatenate to the end of that wb.path. The exact same path property that I applied to the active workbook, we're now just getting that property off the workbook that we just opened, which is going to be report.xlsm. All right, so let's go ahead and see if this works. I'm going to save this and press F5 to execute. All right, and there we see report.xlsm open. This is just a random file. You can see we have this message box pop up. You've just opened report.xlsm. That's coming from our very first message box. This is getting the name property of this workbook. And then OK. And now we can see the file location of what you just opened is right here. This is using the path property of this new Excel workbook that we just opened. So just to clarify, the name and the path properties that we just used are coming from this report workbook that we just opened. They're not coming from this application object workbook where we actually wrote our macro code. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and press OK. And that's it. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. We did a quick review of the open method on the workbook's collection object as well as the path property on a workbook. The open method is used to open a brand new workbook. In fact, you can do much more complex operations like open every single workbook in a given directory on the computer. That's a much more complex operation. But you can sort of imagine the kind of scenario where this might be helpful. Perhaps you're going to have a directory of, let's say, revenue reports, one for every month of the year, and you want to iterate or go through each one of them, open them up one by one, and perform the exact same process in each. That's the kind of scenario where you might need to open a workbook, and that open method will help you do that. All right, that's all there is to cover here, so I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the close method on the workbook's collection object. This is not to be confused with the close method on a single workbook, but it operates pretty much the same way. When you call the close method on the workbook's collection, it closes every single open workbook in Excel. So here in my Visual Basic Editor, I currently have 2 VBA projects listed right here on the left. That means I have 2 workbooks open. The first one is Report, and the second one is the workbook's object. And I'm just going to write a procedure here in the second workbook right here, the workbook's object, which is going to be responsible for closing everything. So I'm going to call this procedure close everything. And just as a reminder, whenever you're doing something like this, it might be a good idea to disable your application alerts before you do anything. This just ensures that the user isn't prompted with any annoying dialog boxes. So I'm going to do application.displayAlerts, and I'm going to set it equal to false to disable it at the very top of my procedure. I'm going to copy and paste this below, set it equal to true right here, and then right here, we're going to do workbooks.close. So we're calling the close method on the entire collection. If you wanted to target a specific workbook, all you have to do is just wrap a parentheses after here and specify the index position or the name of the workbook that you want to target. In this case, we're targeting the entire collection. So every single workbook, in this case, the 2 that we have open, will be closed. Let's go and save this and see what happens when we press F5. And there we go. You can see we've actually closed all of the workbooks, so there's nothing even showing up here. If I close this, that brings us back to Excel, and we can see there's not even any workbook open in Excel. We're just getting this gray screen, which is sort of like a pending screen that says, hey, you have Excel open, but you don't actually have any workbooks open inside the application. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I'll see you in the next one. All right, so in previous lessons, we took a look at how we can open and close an existing Excel workbook. And in this lesson, we'll see how we can create or generate a brand new workbook using VBA. So let's dive right into it. In my Excel Visual Basic Editor, I'm going to create a brand new procedure. I'm going to call it Create New Workbook. And the way we do that is by referencing our workbook's collection object, the entire collection, not just any one workbook. And we have a convenient add method on that workbook's collection, and this will do it. We're not even required to put in any arguments here to make this work. So let's go ahead and execute this with F5, and we're going to see right here on the left side, we can see that this workbook has been created, and we can also see it right here. This book 1 that's been generated is a brand new Excel workbook. Now, nothing has actually happened inside here. We haven't written anything to it. We haven't even saved this brand new workbook, but now it has been generated. So this add method on the workbooks collection is equivalent to pressing Control-N in your main Excel interface. It just creates a brand new unsaved workbook. By the way, this method, the add method that we see right here, is going to return back to us the workbook that's just been created. So if you want to store it in a variable so you can continue to, for example, access its properties or call methods on it, all you have to do is declare a workbook variable and then set that workbook variable to the return value of this method invocation, and that'll get you that actual specific workbook. There's one property I want to introduce you to here that is related to the process of generating a brand new workbook, and that is the Sheets in New Workbook property on the application object. This is actually both a readable and a writable property. So we can take a look at it right here. Application Sheets in New Workbook. And this is actually a perfectly named property. It reflects how many sheets a brand new workbook will have. So if I execute this now, we can see it's currently set to 3, but I can very easily overwrite this. So right here in my procedure, if I wanted to generate a workbook that, let's say, had 2 worksheets instead, all I have to do is reference that Sheets in New Workbook property. And then instead of reading it, all I have to do is write it. Again, we can just set that property with an equal sign. Let's say I want 2 worksheets in my new workbook. When I press F5, we're going to see this new workbook appear. And here we can see it has Sheet 1 and Sheet 2. I can go ahead and close it and try with another example. If I want it to instead be 10 worksheets, I can go ahead and execute that. And you can see all automatically here they've appeared, but just to prove it to you in the Excel interface, here is my new workbook, and it has 10 total worksheets. So you can modify that application property, sheets in new workbook, to set how many sheets will be present whenever you invoke add and actually generate a brand new workbook. There's one more thing that I actually want to show you, so I'm going to get rid of this thing right here. In addition to simply invoking workbooks.add, what we can actually do is feed it an optional argument for a parameter called template. And this is the easiest way that we can create a copy of an existing workbook. If we want to create a brand new workbook here, but we want it to contain everything that another workbook has, we can actually feed in that workbook that we want to make a copy of as the first argument here. And we're going to basically follow the exact same syntax that we did with the open method, where we have to provide the path to the workbook, including its entire file name and directory, where it is located on your file system. So I'm currently in the exact same folder where I have an Excel workbook called report, and let's say I want to make a copy of that workbook. I have to get the actual path, and I know that it's in the same directory as this workbook, so I can do something like this. I can get my active workbook, which is this one. I can get its path. This is going to give me the actual string that represents the current directory where this workbook is located, and I can concatenate onto this a string. Remember, just like in the last couple lessons, this is going to give me the directory. I still have to append a backslash here so I can go into the current directory where I am in, and then I could write the name of the Excel workbook that I want to make a copy of, the full name, including the extension. Watch out for that extension, because it's actually going to be pretty troublesome if you're trying to open the right Excel file but typing in the wrong extension. It's just going to say, hey, I'm not able to find this file, and you might be confused for a while. So this should do it. So let's go ahead and see if this works. I'm going to press F5, and we're going to create a brand new workbook right here. And you can see it's actually going to get the name report 1 rather than book 1 or book 2. So it's going to take the name of the file that it's making a copy of and then just append a numeric count to the end. So our file is named report, so this is going to be report 1, report 2, report 3, etc. And we can see right here all that workbook contained was report in cell A1, and you can see that that data has been copied over in this new copy. So we've successfully copied the report XLSM file in this brand new workbook that's been generated. And just to show you an alternate syntax, as a reminder, every argument that we feed into a method invocation is associated with a corresponding parameter. The parameter that we're actually feeding this string argument to is called template. So we can actually write it in right here, template : equals, the exact same syntax. Just if you want to be a bit more explicit, this will also work. So when I press F5, there we go. We create a brand new workbook. You can see it's still called report 1 because we haven't saved the previous one that we just opened. We just kind of threw it out there, threw it out of memory. So you can see we've made a successful copy. All right, so I'm going to close this, and that's all there is to cover in this lesson. We talked about the add method on the workbooks collection object. That allows us to generate a brand new workbook from scratch. You can very easily make a copy of an existing workbook simply by feeding the path to that workbook that you want to copy as the first argument here. And if you also want to modify the number of sheets that are going to exist in a new workbook, you have to modify the sheets in new workbook property on the top level application object. That property is both readable and writable. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I'll see you in the next one. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the save as and save methods on a workbook object. They predictably allow us to save both a brand new workbook and an existing one that has had changes made to it. So let's go ahead and create a procedure in this lesson. We're going to create 2 brand new workbooks from scratch. We're going to save both of them on our local file system. Then we're going to make some changes to them, save them again, and then close them. We're going to do this all within the context of a single VBA procedure. So it's going to be a more complex operation than the ones we've done so far in this lesson. So let's begin here by creating a new procedure. I'm just going to call it create and save 2 workbooks. All right. First thing I want to do here is actually modify our sheets in new workbook setting on our application object. I want every single newly created workbook to have exactly 2 worksheets. So I'm going to do application.sheets in new workbook. This is a readable and writable property, so I can simply set it equal to 2. The next thing I want to do is actually declare 2 variables which are going to represent the 2 workbooks that I'm going to create. I'm going to use these variables to store those workbooks so I can later reference them very easily and invoke additional methods on them. So I'm going to call my variables W1 and W2, and they're both going to be Excel workbook objects. So W1 as a workbook object, and comma W2 as another workbook. This is a shorthand syntax for declaring 2 different variables on 2 different lines. All right, so now we're ready to actually create two brand new workbooks. We know that we can use the add method on the workbooks collection. And this add method is not just going to create a brand new workbook, it's actually going to return it back to us as the return value of this method. So we can actually assign the variable, either W1 or W2, to this invocation, and it's going to then represent the workbook that we get back. Now remember that whenever we assign an Excel object to a variable, we have to prefix it with the set keyword. We can't just use the equal sign. So set W1 equal to the return value of this, which is a brand new workbook. We can do the exact same thing here to W2. Now this is going to create two brand new workbooks. This is equivalent to pressing Control+N twice in our Excel interface, but it's not actually going to save them locally to our file system. In order to do that, we have to use the save as method on a workbook object. This is the first method that I want to introduce you to in this lesson. So let's go ahead. We're going to do W1.saveAs. Right? So whenever you create a brand new workbook, you can't just call save on it, because save is equivalent to pressing Control+S. You can't really save it unless you've actually saved it first with the save as. The equivalent thing in Excel is whenever you press save for the first time, it's going to bring up that dialog box that's going to show you where you are and allow you to choose a file name and a file type. Before you can even do Control+S, kind of automatically, you have to save it once in that initial format. That's the exact same thing that we're doing here. So this save as method, we want to take a look here at the two first parameters, which are file name and file format. File name is going to represent the actual name that we want to give to the file, and file format is going to be an enumeration that's going to represent the exact type of file that we want to save. We can save as a macro-enabled file, as a plain XLSX, as a CSV, etc. So what I want to do here is I want to give these workbooks two names. The first is going to be red, the second is going to be blue. And usually the way this works is if you just give the name of the workbook, for example, red.xlsm like so, it should save in the local directory or the directory in which the current active workbook is located. So if I run this macro right here, it should save my red file in the exact same directory as where this workbook is located, this workbook being the workbook object.xlsm, which we can see right here. However, I have had some issues in the past whenever I use the syntax. Sometimes it's just finicky and sometimes it results in an error. So the easiest way to make this work is to actually make sure that you're specifying the exact path where you want to save, even if it's in the same directory. So what I want to do here is I want to rely on, again, getting the path of the current workbook. And I actually tried active workbook first, but that also didn't work. There was some kind of issue. So an alternative here that worked for me is instead of using active workbook, we can actually use this workbook. And this is basically the same thing as active workbook. It's going to reference the workbook that's directly attached to this actual macro, while active workbook will target the workbook that is currently activated or clicked on or selected in the case that you have multiple workbooks open. In theory, active workbook should work here, but for some reason it wasn't working for me, but this workbook does in this case, so I'm going to use that. It still represents the exact same single workbook that we have open now, and it's going to have the exact same properties as any other workbook object. So on our current workbook, we want to get the path property, and that is going to give us, again, the complete path to where our current file is. I can, in fact, show you this in the immediate window. If I simply do this workbook.path, we can see this is where my thing is saved, and this is going to give me the directory. So what I have to do here, again, just like we did a couple lessons ago, is not just concatenate the file name, but concatenate a slash. So we're actually creating a slash right after this directory and then saving it within the current directory. And that should do it for red. Now, the second argument here is going to be file format, which is the exact type of file that we want to save it as, and this expects an enumeration. The one we're looking for is Excel Open XML Workbook Macro Enabled. If you look at the online documentation for the save as method, it's very easy to find a specific page that will give you all of the possible options, but for now you can just trust me on this. I'm going to use my IntelliSense feature here by pressing Control plus Spacebar, and I'm going to type in Excel Open XML, and I want this one, Workbook Macro Enabled. This saves it as our XLSM file format. Simply putting it as part of the string name right here that represents the name is not good enough. We actually have to manually tell Excel how to save this workbook. All right, so that should do it for workbook number 1. We can go ahead and copy this code below because the only thing that's going to change is the actual workbook that we're calling it on. We want to call it on W2 this time, and we want to give it a different name to avoid any accidental overwrites. We're going to call this one blue. All right, so now we've generated 2 workbooks and we now saved both of them. Let's go ahead and make changes to both of these new workbooks. So I'm going to do W1 first. Let's target the first worksheet in this one. Let's target a random range here like C3, and let's write in a value here like red with an exclamation point. All right, I can then do W2 here. Let's target another worksheet here. I know I'm going to have a second worksheet because I mandated in the very first line of the procedure that all newly created workbooks will have 2 worksheets exactly, so I know I'll have reference to a second worksheet here. Let's target a totally random range again, E5, and let's write in the value blue right here. And just like with the regular Excel interface, these operations here are synchronous, which means they occur one at a time in order, in sequence from top to bottom. So just because we've saved the workbook here, that does not mean that these changes will be preserved. You can imagine it as if we created these brand new workbooks and then written some kind of thing in our Excel interface. We still have to press Control S again in order to actually force Excel to save and commit those changes. So after we've made these changes to the worksheets, we can now introduce you to the second method that I want to show you, which is the plain save method. So this is the exact same thing as pressing Control S. Whenever you have an existing workbook and it already is saved on your file system and you simply want to change the changes that you've made to it, either locally in the interface or with VBA, you can use the save method on the workbook object. We want to do the exact same thing to workbook number 2. And now that these changes are done, we can go ahead and close both of them. W1 close, and let's do W2 close again here as well. And just to avoid any kind of potential errors, what I want to do at the very top here, just for safety, is use our familiar display alerts property on the application object. Let's set it to false at the very beginning, and then let's go ahead and set it back to true at the very end. This may not be necessary here, but it doesn't hurt, and it's a good chance to tie together all of the concepts that we've introduced so far in this section of the course. So that should do it. We have created 2 brand new workbooks. We have assigned them to variables. We have saved them both as red and blue as macro-enabled workbooks. We've then made some changes, saved those changes, closed them, and that should do it. So I'm going to save this, press F5. We might see a couple quick blurry things popping up on screen, and that's just going to be the macro going through its motions. Perfect, there we go. And now it's all gone. We have almost no evidence that this macro ran. We don't have any open workbooks right here. But if I go back into my Windows Explorer, here's the current directory where I have the files for the course. And here you can see we've generated blue and red. And if I open blue right here, we can see here on sheet 1, there should be some values written in, maybe sheet 1 or sheet 2. It's actually on sheet 2. It's the second workbook we saved. So here we have blue right here in cell E5. And if I go ahead and open red, which was the first workbook we saved, here in red, we have it written right here in cell C3. So everything has gone as expected. And notice as well that we have 2 sheets, both in red and blue. All right, so that's all there is to cover in this lesson. We talked about a lot of things, but we primarily talked about the save as and save methods on a workbook object. They both save changes. You want to use save as whenever you've created a brand new workbook or whenever you want to make a copy of an existing one. It saves a brand new file. It's the same thing as pressing Control S when you have a brand new workbook and it hasn't yet been saved. We have to provide it with a file name. It's a good idea to provide the full path if you want to make sure that everything is going to be as stable and less likely to run into errors as possible. And then we also talked about save, which is what you can call whenever the workbook already exists and you just want to commit some changes. All right, that's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I'll see you in the next one. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the activate method on a workbook, which effectively makes it the active workbook. This is the exact same thing as clicking into it in the Excel interface. It makes it the active or the highlighted workbook. And as we know, we have an active workbook property available on our application object, and that's what's going to be assumed whenever we reference something like a sheet or a range. We're always going to have the assumption of the active workbook if a workbook is not explicitly specified. So let's take a look here. I'm going to use the 2 files that we created in the last lesson, red and blue. I'm going to open them and then I'm going to make some changes to them. But I'm going to open them, and rather than referencing them explicitly, I'm going to make each one active first of all before I make the corresponding changes, and you can see how activate can be helpful in that sense. So what I want to do here is create a new procedure. I'm just going to call it make changes to workbooks. Let's review a couple of the concepts that we introduced previously. I want to declare 2 variables to represent the 2 workbooks that we're about to open. I'm just going to call the variables the exact same names as the workbooks, so red and blue. Dim red as workbook, and then blue as workbook as well. And we can go ahead and set each of these to the return expression, not of the add method anymore, but rather of the open method on the workbooks object, which allows us to open a single workbook and then returns that actual object. So I'm going to follow the exact same logic as we did in the last lesson. I'm going to actually reference the explicit path of this workbook, which is the workbook object is actually its name. I want to get the directory in which it's in and then concatenate the name of the workbook that we want to actually open, which is in the exact same directory. So this workbook.path, That's going to give me the actual directory, and I want to concatenate onto the end of that a slash, and then actually open my red.xlsm file, which is in the current directory. I can go ahead and copy this code below, and of course the only thing I'm going to change here is I want to save it to a different variable this time. This is blue, and I want to open the blue file rather than the red file. All right, so we've opened these two, and let's say we don't know which one is currently active. Let's say we want to write something to range A1. How do we know which workbook is actually active? Well, one thing we can do is explicitly use the activate method to make sure that one workbook is now the specifically active one. Now, we could, of course, be even more explicit and literally write red, and then we know that any changes will be made to the red workbook. But the activate method is just another way to simulate that exact same process. It kind of behaves more like a user will. A user will click from workbook to workbook, and that's exactly the kind of action that we're simulating here in the Visual Basic Editor. So on my red workbook, if I'm not sure if it's the currently selected one or the active one, I can simply call the activate method on this workbook. That's the exact same thing as literally clicking into it with the mouse. So now it's active. It becomes the property of the active workbook property on the application object. So if I reference active workbook now, I'm 100% certain that it's going to reference the red workbook instead of the blue workbook. That is now guaranteed because of the activate method. There's no chance for error. We have the exact same logic when we talk about this concept of the active sheet. We haven't talked about this one as much throughout the course, but active sheet represents the currently selected worksheet within the currently active workbook. So we could do something like worksheets here and target a specific worksheet by name or by its index position, but we may just simply want to target the one that's currently selected, that the user is currently on. And we can always get that with active sheet. So it doesn't matter if our workbook, which is red in this case, opens to sheet 1 or sheet 2 or sheet 3. Active sheet will always target whatever is currently active. So once we're on that one, we can go ahead and target something like, let's say, range A1. And we're going to write in another red. And we can go ahead and do something like the exact same logic for blue. So now that we're on red, we need to switch our focus to blue. So on blue, I can call the activate method. So now we're going to switch our focus to the other one. And now we can apply the exact same logic. You can hopefully start to see the effectiveness of this. Right now, we're going to be writing different values to each, but if there's some kind of operation where we want to do the exact same process to 20 workbooks in a row, and it's literally the exact same thing step by step, we can simply go through each collection of workbooks or worksheets perhaps, simply make each one the active one, and then repeat the same code or the same logic, and it'll simply be effective in that way because it's going to apply the same procedure or the same set of rules to every item in a collection. So activate can be really effective in those situations. Right now, I just want to target range A1 on my blue workbook, the active sheet on that one, and I can do this to be another blue. Cool, so now we can go ahead. I'm actually not going to close this or save this. I'm just going to leave it open so we can see that the results are live. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to press F5 to run it. And now we can see Excel is going to open those two workbooks. I can take a look here. Here is red and here is blue. We can see that red should have another red written, and you can see it is effectively done that. We can see that represented in cell A1, and it's done it on sheet 1. So one thing I'm actually curious about is I want to go ahead and activate sheet 2 and save the workbook in this state, and then I want to close it. We'll come back to that in just a second. And right here, I want to also take a look at blue. We can see another blue has been written here, so everything is effective here. We haven't explicitly mentioned either the red or the blue. We just activated them, which ensured that the active workbook and active sheet properties could target exactly what we wanted it to do. So in this workbook, what I want to do is also switch over to sheet 2. So now on both of these workbooks, we've changed the active sheet at the moment of save. So now, in theory, if I rerun this macro right here, we should be able to repeat the exact same logic, but now we're going to write another red and another blue into the second sheet in each of those respective workbooks. So when I execute this, let's see what happens. Because we did that, if I go to red, we can see that another red is now written in cell A1 of sheet 2. So whenever you save and exit an Excel workbook, it's going to preserve which was the currently active sheet. And because we used active sheet here, rather than an explicit reference to a specific worksheet, it simply targeted that one dynamically. So sometimes you may want that kind of logic where you may want to target whatever workbook is open or whatever sheet is currently active, just do it on that one. That's specifically really effective when the user runs a macro from a specific workbook or a specific sheet, and you may not know exactly where they are, but you know that wherever they are currently in their Excel interface is what you want to target. It's in those kinds of situations that properties like active workbook and active sheet can be really effective. But that's all there is to cover in this lesson. We reviewed the open method on the workbooks collection object, and we also took a look at the activate method on a workbook. It makes a workbook active. It makes it the currently selected one. It is the exact same thing as clicking into it with your mouse. In this quick lesson, I want to go over the workbook close method, which we briefly introduced a few lessons ago and kind of glossed over. The close method closes a single workbook. So what I actually want to do in this lesson is pretty similar to what we did in the last one. I just want to open our red and blue workbooks, write some values, and close them. And I want to show you how we can actually consolidate the close operation as well as the save operation. So I'm going to go ahead and copy our procedure code from a lesson or two ago. And I'm going to call our new procedure right here, close workbooks. I'm going to keep the first three lines here. What we're doing here again is declaring two variables, red and blue. Each is going to store a workbook, and we're opening the red and blue workbook and storing them in those variables. I'm going to go ahead and try a different syntax here from the last lesson. I'm no longer going to use activate. I'm just going to manually target some of the ranges on my worksheet. So instead of doing active workbook, what I can do is actually literally target red. This is just an example of an alternate syntax. Whenever you're programming, you often have many different ways that you can solve a problem. And instead of targeting active sheet, I can literally target something like worksheets 2. And let's say range A2 this time. And let's just do something here like red is awesome. It really doesn't matter. Just something random and arbitrary. I'm going to do the exact same logic with the line below. I'm going to get rid of this activation. I'm going to replace this with blue. And let's target, again, worksheets 2. Let's say again, range A2 again. And let's do blue, blue, blue. Doesn't really matter. So in the past, what we did is we actually called the save method and then we closed. Well, we do have a convenient method called close, and it actually takes a parameter called save changes, which allows us to close and also save the workbook. This is very similar to exiting a plain Excel worksheet and then pressing that yes button whenever it gives you the dialog box to confirm. So we talked about this idea of close a few lessons ago, and we kind of glossed over it. But close actually does have that first parameter of save changes, and that expects a Boolean argument, either true or false. True if you want to save the changes, false if you do not want to save them. So what I can do here is actually just show you this side by side. I'm going to call close on red, and I'm going to say that I want to save those changes. But on blue, when I call close, what I'm going to say is that I do not want to save those changes, so I'm going to make this false, which in theory means that this line right here should not be there. So we shouldn't see blue, blue, blue because those changes are not going to be written. All right, so you can always just do red.close, you can do red.save, red.close, and then blue.save, blue.close, or you can put save changes in as the first parameter here, the second thing you write on the line following the close method, and it will accomplish the exact same result. So let's go ahead. I just want to make sure red and blue are not open first. Let me go ahead and close them. We can save, let's not save those changes yet. Get rid of blue right here. And I can go ahead and execute this from scratch. Let's go ahead and open those workbooks. All right, so now the entire thing has executed. I can now open red and blue. And as I recall, on red, we should expect to see changes on sheet 2. So when we open red, here we have red is awesome in cell A2. Everything is exactly as expected. Perfect. So we've closed it and we've saved those changes. Now if I open blue to sheet 2 again, we can see here on sheet 2, nothing has been written in cell A2 because those changes have not been preserved, so it is still in the exact same state or shape as it was at the conclusion of the previous lesson. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. We talked about the close method in a little bit more detail, particularly the save changes parameter, which expects a Boolean argument. If you give it a true, it will save the changes, and that will allow you to avoid using an additional call to the save method on a workbook. There are many different ways to accomplish the exact same thing in Excel. That's really the bigger takeaway here, and there's nothing wrong or right about one specific solution. It's whatever makes sense to you, whatever is cleanest, whatever is more optimal, whatever makes the best sense to you. Go with that approach and commit that to memory, practice that over and over, and you'll find that it will typically work. Nobody's going to judge you if you do 2 lines instead of 1 line. It's just whatever works for the given situation. That's all there's to cover in this lesson, so I'll see you in the next one. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the add method on the worksheets collection object. It creates a brand new worksheet in the current workbook. So in my Visual Basic editor, I'm going to define a new procedure called generate new worksheet. And in here, all I'm going to do is reference my worksheets collection object and call the add method. It can be invoked by itself with no parameters or arguments, but we are going to dive into some optional parameters in just a bit. So the way this works is that if we simply invoke this, it's going to add the worksheet before the currently active sheet in the workbook. So right now, as we can see here on the bottom left corner of my Excel interface, sheet 1 is currently active, which means whenever I generate a new worksheet, it will be added before sheet 1. So when I execute this with F5, you can see the new sheet has been added and it's been placed in front of sheet 1. So it's always going to be in front of or before the active sheet. As another example, I'm going to make sheet 2 right here at the end my active sheet. So when I rerun this macro, it should place it before the active sheet, which is going to be right here in between sheet 1 and sheet 2. So when I execute this, there we can see sheet 4 has been added and it's been placed right before sheet 2 and right after sheet 1. So whichever one you currently have selected or activated in the Excel interface, this method call will place the new worksheet before that. How can we modify that? Well, that's where our optional parameters come in. So the add method has two parameters. One of them is before and the other one is after. You cannot use both of them. You can only use one of them in a single method invocation, and both of them expect a worksheet object that specifies which worksheet you want to create. Do you want to place the new one before or after? So as an example, let's begin with before. What I'm going to do is just give the parameter of before. And here I can provide a different worksheet, and the new one will be placed before this argument. So for example, I have sheet 1 right here, and it doesn't matter which one is currently active, so I'm just going to select a random one. Let's say I want to place my newly created worksheet before sheet 1. In that case, what I can do is target sheet 1 with something like this: worksheets, sheet 1. So now I'm using the syntax to extract a specific worksheet using the name of it. So when I execute this with F5, there we can see sheet 5 has been created and it's been placed in front of or before sheet 1. And you can use, of course, any kind of syntax that you want to reference this worksheet. So if I wanted to use a numeric reference, I certainly could as well. So for example, if I scroll back here, I now see that sheet 5 is number 2 in sequence. So if I wanted to create something before sheet 5 or before sheet 2, I could simply replace this with the number 2, execute this with F5, and now we can see my new sheet, sheet 6, has been placed before what was formerly sheet 2, which is actually the second sheet in order, which was sheet 5. All right, and the exact same logic applies when it comes to creating things with the after parameter. What I want to do here, though, is just delete a couple of these so we don't get too confused. I'm just going to reduce it to a couple options here. So let's just delete all of these, maybe get down to 2 worksheets. I'm going to delete this one as well, sheet 3, and let's also delete sheet 4. All right, so now we're down to simply 2 worksheets, sheet 1 and sheet 2. Again, it doesn't matter which one is the active one if we're using the before or after parameter, because we're going to explicitly specify where to place the new worksheet. So right here as another example, I'm just going to comment this. And this time I'm going to invoke add on worksheets, but rather than providing it with the before parameter, I'm going to provide it with the after parameter. Takes the exact same argument, a valid worksheet object. So right now, if I want to place my new worksheet after sheet 1, I can do this, worksheets, let's say sheet 1, targeting it by its name, and this will create it right in between. We can see sheet 7 has been placed after sheet 1. Similarly, if I want to provide a numeric argument, let's say I want to place it now after sheet 2, which is going to be the third sheet in line, I can say after sheet 3 is where I want to add my new worksheet, and then it's going to be the 4th one in sequence. So right here, sheet, the new one that's been created right here that we can see highlighted, has been placed right after what is sheet 3. All right, now an important thing to note here is that it's going to follow the traditional Excel naming scheme, so it's just going to go sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3. If you want to change this, what you can do is assign this method invocation to a variable, because of course this is going to return back the brand new worksheet object, and then you can modify the name property on that worksheet if you actually want to rename it. But that's all there is to cover in this lesson. We talked about the add method, invoking it by itself, as well as invoking it with the before and after parameters. Now, before we conclude, I want to leave off with an interesting point, which is, what if I wanted to write a more dynamic macro that would automatically add a worksheet to the end of my list of worksheets. But I didn't want to manually specify the explicit last position. For example, right now I have 4 worksheets. So of course I could say put my next worksheet after worksheet 4. But what if I had 20 worksheets or 10 worksheets or 100? What if I wanted to write a macro that would be dynamically able to figure out where to put my new worksheet and guarantee that it would always be at the very end, that it would always be at the very end of the list of worksheets that I have listed here in my bottom left? How can we dynamically figure that out? That's going to be the problem that you're going to tackle in your very next challenge in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the visible property on our worksheet object. The visible property allows us to hide or unhide a worksheet. Now, it includes all of the standard functionality that we have in our regular Excel interface. For example, if I hover my mouse over any one of these sheets and I right-click, we have our familiar hide and unhide options. And if you've never used these before, all they do is hide a worksheet. So it doesn't permanently delete it, it just hides it in this kind of temporary box. And then if you right-click here and say unhide, you can find the worksheet that you just hid or any number of them and then unhide them again and they'll pop back up into view. Now we have all this functionality available in VBA and we also have a more powerful option which allows us to hide a worksheet and only permit it to be visible again if another piece of VBA code allows it to be unhidden. In other words, we can hide it but prohibit the user in our actual Excel interface from unhiding it. So let's take a look here in my Visual Basic Editor. I'll define a procedure and I'll call it hide some sheets. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of the different ways that we can set the visible property. It's actually a powerful, flexible property, and it accepts a wide variety of inputs. So let's target a worksheet. Let's say worksheet number 2, which is going to be sheet 2 in my list. And we're going to access the visible property, and it can be overwritten. And one of the first things that we can give it is actually a Boolean argument, either true or false. If we make this false, what it's going to do predictably is make the sheet invisible or not visible, which means it's going to be hidden. So when I execute this macro, we're going to see sheet 2 disappear from view in my bottom left corner of the Excel interface. So let me go ahead and press F5, and now we can see sheet 2 is completely absent. We can change this back to true. The worksheet, again, is not permanently deleted. It's just hidden. It's just kind of hiding there behind the scenes. If we want to bring it back here, we can simply set this to true, execute again, and now sheet 2 has appeared once again in my worksheet. But we're not strictly limited to a Boolean argument. We can actually provide the visible property a bunch of enumerations. As a reminder, enumeration is just a combination of different constants that we can use to represent different numeric things behind the scenes. So let's take a look at that. So what I'm going to do here is actually reference each one of my worksheets, and I'm going to assign each one of their visible properties a different value for the enumeration. The first one that we have available to us, if I show my IntelliSense by pressing Control plus spacebar, is Excel sheet visible. And this is the exact same thing as setting it equal to an argument of true. This makes it visible or guaranteed to be present in our actual workbook. So this would not change anything because all of our 3 sheets are currently visible. All right. Now our second option is the corresponding one, which is equivalent to false, and that's going to be Excel sheet hidden. What this is going to do is hide the worksheet. So this is the exact same thing as giving an argument of false. So you might be thinking, what's the point of these enumerations? We've covered all of our bases with true or false. Well, it turns out there's actually a third option available to us, a third enumeration, a third constant. That's an even more severe or strict form of hiding, and it's going to be this one. So let's do worksheets 3, and I'm going to set the visible property to Excel sheet very hidden. So this is kind of a funny name. It's very hidden. What does that mean? This is actually an option that's not available to us in the Excel interface. What this means is that the sheet will be hidden and the user will not be able to unhide it from the Excel interface, which means the only way that they can unhide it is by running some kind of macro that will reveal it again. In other words, this is basically VBA exclusive, which means we hide the sheet and there's no way without running additional VBA code that the user can ever access it again. In comparison, this hidden one will hide it using VBA, but the user can still unhide it using their traditional clicking syntax in the Excel interface. So let's take a look. What we expect to happen here is that nothing will happen with sheet 1. Both sheet 2 and sheet 3 will disappear, but we're only going to be able to get sheet 2 back. So let's go ahead and execute F5. All right, so sheet 1 is gone, and if I right-click here and go to unhide, you'll notice this list will only show me sheet 2. That's because I used the enumeration Excel sheet hidden. That means the sheet has been hidden, but the user can still bring it back. They can press OK. But notice sheet number 3, which we set to very hidden, is not present here. There is no way the user can get it back unless they run some other additional macro that then sets worksheet 3 to a visible property of either true or Excel sheet visible. So that's the whole point. If you truly want to hide something from the user, but not permanently delete it, that's a really good way that you can utilize Excel sheet very hidden. So I'm going to go ahead and press cancel just so that we leave things in the original state. And that's all there's to cover in this lesson. We talked about the visible property on a singular worksheet object. We can give it a wide variety of data types or values. The first is a bunch of Booleans, true or false. True is going to make it visible or present in our Excel interface. False will hide it or make it invisible. We also can provide it a wide variety of enumerations, either Excel sheet visible, Excel sheet hidden, or Excel sheet very hidden. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I'll see you in the next one. All right, so now let's take a look at how we can copy a worksheet, either to a brand new workbook or to our current open workbook. So what I'm going to do here is put in a random value in cell A1, just literally the word random, just so we can make sure we're properly copying the contents of a sheet. And I'm actually going to begin here in the immediate window before we write any procedure. So on any given worksheet object, for example, worksheets sheet 1 is going to target the only visible worksheet I currently have open. There is a copy method. Now, if we invoke this without any additional parameters, it is going to copy the worksheet, but it's going to do that in a brand new workbook. We can take a look at this. I'm going to press enter. You can see Excel has opened a brand new workbook. For me, it's going to be book 3, but for you, it's probably going to be book 1. And we can see the value random has been copied, so everything looks great. And of course, if we wanted to keep this, that's totally fine. We could just save this brand new workbook and work with it. So I'm just going to go ahead and close out of here. Most likely, though, I find that you're typically going to be copying worksheets to the exact same workbook. So let's see how we can do that right here. It's a pretty simple, intuitive process. I'm going to go ahead and define a new procedure. I'm going to call it copy worksheet. And I'm once again going to target sheet 1. In fact, let me alternate my syntax here and simply target the first sheet, which is going to target sheet 1. I'm once again going to do copy, but this time all we need to do is provide either a before parameter or the after parameter. We've dealt with this before, I believe, when we were dealing with the add method on the worksheets collection. I believe that's correct. So, yep. So the exact same signature is applied to the copy method as the add method. So we have a before parameter and an after parameter, and they both expect a worksheet argument. You can't do both, but you can do either one, and it's going to determine where in our current workbook we're actually going to copy our this worksheet in terms of placement. So where do we want to put it after it's been copied? Well, right now we only have one worksheet, which is sheet 1, so we can clarify whether we want the new one to be placed before or after it. So let's begin with the, let's say, the after parameter. So what I'm going to do is do after. And remember, this expects an argument of a worksheet object, not just the index position. So if I want to extract the exact same worksheet that I have now, I can do worksheets 1. So what I'm saying here is get sheet 1, get its contents, copy it, and then the copy, place that after sheet 1. So it should appear right here to the right. Let's go ahead and execute with F5. And we can see sheet 1 along with this parentheses that indicates it's a copy has appeared right here. And we can, of course, do the exact same logic, but using the before syntax. So what I'm going to do here is comment this out. And let's say I now want to place it before sheet 1. What I can do is do worksheets. I can target sheet 1 in any way. I'm just going to do by name now, sheet 1. And I want to copy it, but I'm going to provide it the alternate parameter, which is before. It also expects an argument of a worksheet. And so I can give it once again, sheet 1. Or worksheets number 1, and this time it's going to place it before sheet 1. The advantage of this approach, of course, is that we don't have to worry about what is the currently active sheet or the selected sheet. It's just going to follow this explicit logic of copying sheet 1 and then placing it before sheet 1. So when I execute this, there is our new copy, and you'll notice it's been placed before sheet 1. So you can apply before or after any worksheet that you want in our list, and it's going to make a copy and place it there. We can see it is the copy. In fact, we have the word random right here. All right, that's all there's to cover in this lesson. If you want to copy a sheet to the current workbook, just provide that before or after parameter. If you want to copy it to a brand new workbook, just do copy by itself, and that'll do it for you. I'll see you in the next lesson. Okay, so now we've covered how we can hide a worksheet and how we can copy a worksheet. In this lesson, we'll talk about how we can delete a worksheet from the workbook. Pretty simple. It's just going to be the delete method. So what I'm going to do is create a procedure here. I'm going to call it delete worksheet. And let's go ahead and target a worksheet. Let's do something like the first one we have right there, which is our copy, sheet 1, and this one. Doesn't really matter. We can target it by name or we can target it by its index position. And I'm going to go ahead and call the delete method. There is one important caveat, as you can probably guess by the fact that I made a couple line breaks here, which is whenever you delete a worksheet, it's going to prompt you, or Excel is going to prompt you with that would you like to delete box. We can see it right here. If I try to delete this right here, let me go ahead and press delete. This little box that pops up, this is an example of an alert. We saw a couple examples of this earlier, for example, when we made some changes to our workbook but didn't save them. This is an example of an alert. And yeah, we could run this macro and it would work and the user would just have to click delete. But as we know, we want to automate as much of the process as possible to make it as simple to use as can be. So I'm going to cancel out of here and we're going to use our familiar tactic at the very top. I'm just going to write application.displayAlerts and I'm going to set that equal to false. That will ensure that none of those alerts pop up, allowing the deletion process to proceed as smoothly as possible. I can then go ahead and at the very end of all of my procedure work, I can set this back equal to true just to make sure that we don't kind of disable it all across Excel and that the regular Excel functionality will continue to work as soon as our macro is done running. Let's go ahead and try this. We should be able to delete that that worksheet that's at the very beginning of our list. So I'm going to press F5. And there we can see it's disappeared and now sheet 1 is present. We can go ahead and target another one. So now I want to target this one right here, that other copy that we made in the last lesson. This time around, I'm going to copy it based on its index position, which is going to be number 2. I'm going to go ahead, save this, execute, and press F5. And we can see it's now been deleted. Notice that the hidden worksheets are not being targeted, by the way. That's all there's to cover in this lesson. We talked about the delete method. You can just invoke it as is on a single worksheet object. You don't need to feed it any additional parameters. Just remember that if you want the process to be as smooth as possible for the user, it's a good idea to disable alerts before you do it and then re-enable them after you're done actually deleting the worksheet. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the move method on a worksheet, which allows us to move it around, much like you can do by simply clicking it and dragging it in your Excel interface. Now, unfortunately, I only have one sheet currently visible because we went through a whole bunch of processes of hiding our worksheets a few lessons ago. So I'm just going to go ahead and unhide the remaining 2 worksheets that I have here. So what I can do is target my worksheets, let's say number 2, and I'm just going to set visible equal to Excel sheet visible. That should unhide sheet 2, and I want to do the exact same logic for sheet 3. All right, so now we have 3 sheets, and we can go ahead and proceed. So what I'm going to do here is just buy myself a little bit of space and write a new procedure, and I'm going to call it move worksheet around. It's going to be a pretty simple method call. I'm just going to target a sample worksheet. Let's say we're going to start off with sheet number 2. So I can target it as always anyway, either by name or by index position. Let's go ahead and target it by index position, number 2. And I'm going to call the move method. And exactly like the copy method, exactly like the add method, the move method accepts either a before or an after parameter, which allows us to specify where it is that we want to move it. And before or after both expect a valid worksheet argument, so you can't just give it a number, you have to give it a valid worksheet. So let's say I want to move sheet 2 after sheet 3. So what I can do is write after, and then I'm going to write worksheets, and I'm going to actually target sheet 3 this time by name. So what we're going to do is we're going to target sheet 2 right here. We're going to move it, and we're going to clarify that we want to move it after this worksheet, sheet 3. So when I execute this, we can see now sheet 2 has been placed after sheet 3, which moves it forward, and we've sort of swapped these positions around. Right? Pretty much the exact same rules and logic applies if we want to move it before something. So let's say I now want to take, let's say, sheet 2 again and move it before sheet 1. So I want to take it from the end all the way to the beginning. I can target sheet 2, worksheets. This time I'm going to use the name sheet 2. The move method, this time I'm going to do before, give it the colon equals, and I want to move it to the beginning. So this time I'm going to target the first worksheet in line, which I can target with sheet 1. But I also like to use the index position here because if we do worksheets 1, that always guarantees that we're going to target the very first one in line. So this is a very simple syntax that you can use to always move it before the very first sheet that is in your sequence. All right, so we're going to take sheet 2, move it to the very beginning. Let's try this. and there we go, sheet 2 appears right here in the middle. If I now want to move it, let's say in the middle of these two, sheet 1 and sheet 3, I can either do after sheet 1 or before sheet 3. Those two will have the exact same effect. All right, that's all there is to cover here. We talked about the move method. It has a very similar function or method signature when compared to the copy method and the add method. Simply give it a before or after parameter and give it an argument of a valid worksheet, and it will move that worksheet around.